Hi everyone, my name is Netta. I'm VP of Marketing for WhiteSource. I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar. Today we're going to discuss open source due diligence. We'll start with Ron Rimon, our co-founder and chairman, who's going to talk about his experience in two separate M&A processes. And he's going to be followed by Rami Sass, our CEO, who will describe his M&A experience from the point of view of a VP of R&D or an R&D manager. I'm now going to hand over the microphone to Ron. Go for it.
Hello everybody, this is Ron Rimon. So as Netta mentioned, I'll take you through the experience of managing open source from the point of view of R&D executive, with a primary focus on issues in due diligence. Due diligence can occur for OEM or M&A, but it can also be part of an investment round, or sometimes even larger customers may have some requirements with regard to your open source. Okay, so first a little bit about myself. So my own background is in development. I started as a developer and I grew to manage a team of developers and then manage the whole R&D for a software company. I then had an academic background. I studied computer science, and I was doing some academic work at the time. And since '98, I've been a technology entrepreneur. I've been involved in a few startups over the years in various roles, primarily as a founder. I'm also one of the founders of WhiteSource, but also as an investor or advisor and various other roles. Most of my companies, or almost all of my companies, have been in the enterprise software space. And as part of doing this work, I've experienced a few scenarios where people wanted to do due diligence on our open source, primarily in M&A and OEM, but also in investment rounds, as I mentioned before. So wanted to understand that, when you do an M&A, when you buy a software company, the intellectual property is a major part of what you are actually buying, and so they want to make sure that you are using the open source components in the right way so as not to harm your intellectual property or your ability to do business. As I mentioned, I'll take the viewpoint of a founder or a VP of R&D or engineering, but I will also appeal to other stakeholders. So in each of those cases, you might have investment bankers, VCs, lawyers, the other people that are also interested in the success of the deal, and the open source compliance is an important part, could be an important part of the success of those deals. One comment: this is not a legal advice. I'm not a lawyer, and please take one if this is important to you. So my presentation will be divided into two parts. In the first part, I will talk about the general requirements of the open source management in general, and then in the context of an M&A transaction or an OEM transaction. And then I'll talk about two cases which are very distinct and I think could teach you an important lesson with regard to that. So first, why do people use open source? Because they don't want to develop everything from scratch. So it's like standing on the shoulder of giants. If you talk to any developer today, they're using a lot of open source. I think in practically every software project, they use a lot of open source, not just a little bit, a lot of it. You can think of it like an iceberg. People basically develop their own bit of proprietary code, but that code builds on top of a mountain of open source components, which they integrate into their software, again, because they don't want to develop things from scratch. When you look at a typical product, it might contain a few tens of open source components which those developers have brought into the code, but then those components themselves rely on other open source. So when you count everything together, you might come to a few hundred of those open source components. This is important because most of the developers find it enough to report on the open source that they are using, but they neglect to look at the licenses and other risks that might be involved with the things that those open source components bring with them, which are called the dependencies. Now, in this scenario, what's important is to understand that the developer's viewpoint and the R&D manager viewpoint can be very different. But from the developer's perspective, they want to bring in the open source so they can cut corners, so they can get as quickly as possible to what they need. They're selecting the open source based on its features, based on the recommendations of friends. They might do some proof of concept on it or something like that. They're very interested to know there is a large community behind that open source project and that this community is lively and so forth. Everything else with regard to the management of the open source itself, for them is a nuisance. As soon as they are done bringing it in, integrating it, building their solution, they stop caring about the open source. Okay, so they just care about the functionality of the open source. Now, for you as an R&D manager, when that happens at first, you have to, of course, vet the choice. You have to look at, of course, the features, but also what are the licenses, what are the risks, is there a good security review to it, and so forth. But that's only where your work starts, because right afterwards, you have to continuously manage those open source components. You have to be able to answer questions that might come up in M&A or other places. Basic questions like, what are they? What is your open source inventory? Which components are in your product? Okay, what are the license rates? Is the new version bringing in another component which may be under a different license? You know, does that risk your intellectual property? Things like that. Security vulnerabilities. Open source is code like any other code, so it might contain bugs and it might contain security vulnerabilities. Somebody may find out about it later, much after it is already part of your product, and it might also be patched by the community, but would you know about it? Do you have any mechanism to track it? And so forth. So for you as an executive, the management of the open source is important because you want to protect the property of your company. But of course, what you want also to do is you want to minimize the negative impact on your developers, the negative impact on the schedules of the development, releases, and so forth. So this is kind of where the VP R&D stands. When it comes to the due diligence requirements, again, they come up primarily in M&A, but also in various investment rounds and so forth. The intellectual property is an important part of the deal, and open source is an important part of any intellectual property investigation that somebody may want to do around your product. So what would you be asked? So at the very least, you're going to be asked for a list of all the open source components that exist in your product. It sounds like a simple requirement, but most R&D managers that we have seen know only about the direct components which their people brought into the code and not about all of their dependencies. That could be a major fault. Then you will have to represent that you are complying with all the requirements of the licenses of each of those components, and that those licenses do not harm your own IP. In other words, you have not written patents while using open source which prevent you from applying for those patents. You have not redistributed the GPL code in a way that might require you to open up your own code, you know, things of that nature. I put an asterisk next to represent because it sounds simple, but in many of those deals, you're actually putting a large amount on the side to make sure that you are indeed complying with it, and it might come back to haunt you. So this is the issue with the licensing. Separately, of course, the buyer might inquire about the quality and security of your code, and since the major part of your code is open source, they may want to know about the quality and security of that code as well. So what can you do as a VP of R&D? So until recently, there were two main methods. The first method, which is being used by most people, is the manual method. The manual method, basically, the VP R&D gathers all the developers. He tells them, he or she tells them, look, you cannot use GPL or various other restrictions, and please tell me about every open source that you bring in. Okay, and of course, they hope that they would report. Sometimes they do, sometimes they forget. And the VP of R&D is stuck with the issue of tracking those components manually in an Excel sheet or a Word document or something like that. In most cases, this list very quickly becomes stale, and so basically you are left with the option to pray. Hopefully, nothing will go wrong, and you hope that it's okay. The second option, which has been used only by larger companies, is to use the source code scanner, which means that periodically, every once in a while, you take all of your source code, you put it through a scanner. The scanner tries to identify similarities between parts of your code also called code snippets, and part of known open source. And if it finds something, it alerts you. The problem is that this solution is first very expensive to buy, but even more importantly, it's very expensive to operate. So when people operate it, they basically have to stop everything that they are doing. They usually will do it only during a release. They would generate those alerts. They would have to go through all of those alerts, and there might be thousands of those alerts. I have personally seen one product that contains no less than 70,000 such alerts. That takes a lot of time. Even if you have done it and you have identified a problematic open source, now what you have to do is you have to take off the cover and basically replace this component, find something else to replace it, and so forth. That can be very costly. Altogether, the process itself and the need to possibly undo things may delay your release if it's a release, and may risk your deal if it's a deal. So the other solution, which is a new solution, is basically a solution that integrates into your software development lifecycle. Basically, a tool that will integrate into your continuous integration server or build tool, so that every time that a developer adds a new component, this tool will identify it, will run it through the various filters that you have defined, your policies, will either approve or reject it. But in any event, in any point in time, you will know all the components that are in your code. Always up to date, always current. As I mentioned, this tool can also, since it's standing at the gate, immediately when a developer adds something, you can enforce policy. There is no work. It basically comes with completely automated, no work for you, and it's a very inexpensive solution. So these are the three solutions. Until recently, as I mentioned, there were only two solutions. There was the manual method, which was relatively simple, but really couldn't guarantee you anything. And there was the source code scanner, which was extremely expensive to buy, extremely difficult to operate, and so it was only affordable to a few of the companies. So I would like to take you through two M&A cases in which I have participated, which I think will kind of exemplify the difference between using the manual method and using a solution which is integrated into your software development lifecycle. So again, as I mentioned, the first case we used a manual tracking. In the second case, we used this new tool called the WhiteSource, which Rami will soon demonstrate. It is important to note that none of my companies could ever afford to use a scanner, not just because of the cost of the scanner, but because of the price of operating it. It was simply too cumbersome to operate for most companies. So in the first case, this was an enterprise software company. The VP of R&D knew about the open source issue, and so they basically warned the developers not to use GPL. This was their best approximation of what should or should not be allowed. Of course, it's very crude way to cut between things. And they asked them to report to him on every use. And he himself basically maintained a list of all open source in an Excel sheet. When the question popped up in the M&A due diligence, he simply pulled out that Excel sheet and provided it to the acquirer. That particular Excel sheet had about 25 line items, and that was it. When the acquirer reviewed it, and they were very diligent about it, what they told us back is, look, I mean, your Excel is missing a lot of the documentation with regard to those 25 line items, but even more importantly, where are all the dependencies? These components, we know them, they bring with them some dependencies. You have to report to us about all of those dependencies and their licenses, and assure us that you are complying with those licenses. So the result was that we had to put in a lot more work in the middle of this very stressful due diligence period in order to research all of these open source components. Before long, the list grew from 25 line items to about 300. There were a lot of questions going back and forth, partially because the acquirer understood that we were not really knowing what we were doing with the open source, so they had to question everything that we were doing. They had to they were inclined to actually run our code through a scanner, which again required us in turn to go through thousands of potential matches and to assure them that all of them are false positives, which took us a lot of time. And more importantly, there was a substantial risk hidden there because luckily nothing happened, but something bad could have happened if the deal could have failed if we were to identify a rogue open source. So this was actually the experience that gave rise to WhiteSource. That's how we as a founding team, we were all involved in the deal, and we decided there must be a better solution than using a scanner or using the manual method. There might be some solution in between, and that's what we did. So we developed a solution that was, on one hand, very simple to use and very affordable, and on the other hand, would manage your open source components appropriately. So my second experience, it was also an enterprise software company. Again, the company was using a few tens of open source components, including the dependencies, of course, which would bring it to, I think, about 160 components. But since we already knew about the issue with open source, we started to use WhiteSource when it was still in beta phase. So initially, we used a drag and drop mechanism to simply ask the software to analyze all of our open source. And then when the plugin was available, we used the plugin in order to fully automate that process. So once you put the plugin, there is nothing for you to do, and Rami is going to probably show to you in the demo. Basically, you press a button and you have the list of all the open source. So when the question popped up, in this case, in the M&A due diligence, all that we have to do is issue a WhiteSource report, which was very detailed. It showed the acquirer that we knew what we were doing, probably more detailed than anything else they've seen before by an acquired company, and they basically were satisfied with that. So again, the result here was that there was no work. The plugin works automatically. There is nothing to do. We were not required to put in more work during the due diligence itself, and we didn't have the risk because going into the due diligence, we knew exactly what we had in our software, and we knew there was no risks hidden there. So to sum up before letting Rami go, everybody is using open source. It's almost a must in today's modern environment, but the R&D executive is presented with a dilemma. On one hand, the CEO expects them to develop very quickly to provide more features more quickly to their customers, but also to mitigate the risks. And on the other hand, the developers don't really care about managing open source, and they're also not. So if you let your developers decide what should or shouldn't go in, you should expect inconsistent results, and also most likely that you're going to have some risk hidden in your software. So the bad news, as I mentioned, is that the manual tracking doesn't work. At least didn't work for us. And the scanning is typically very expensive and very laborious and probably not fitting for most companies, except maybe the biggest one. The good news is that this new technology is both effective and easy. It fits natively into your software development lifecycle by integrating with your CI server or build server or something like that. Once you put the plugin, everything is completely automated and provides you with dashboard and everything that allows you to continuously manage everything and be alerted proactively if something bad is happening in your software, both from a licensing perspective as well as from a security vulnerabilities perspective, and it doesn't take you any work. So this is my summary. I'll be looking forward to your questions, and while Rami presents, I'll start developing the answers to your questions. Thank you very much.
We'll let Rami say his piece now. If you have any questions, by the way, please write them in the questions bar. We'll address them at the end of the webinar.
Okay, thank you very much, Netta and Ron. I'll do the second part of today's session. And in this part, we'll cover the due diligence from the VP of R&D's perspective, and specifically the part that open source takes in the due diligence. I'll try to do that quickly as I can, and then show you a demo of what the WhiteSource system actually looks like, and time permitting, try to answer some of your questions. So by way of introduction, I am Rami. I am a co-founder and CEO of WhiteSource. I was the manager of R&D for the M&A transaction described by Ron on his first experience, namely the one that we tracked open source usage manually. I have engineering background and have done R&D managerial positions my entire career, and have architectured and designed WhiteSource's system as well. So I didn't really have time to go to law school. So I'm not a lawyer, and if you need any legal advice, please consult with a lawyer. So what do you need to do when you're running through a due diligence and need to produce an open source usage report? There are three main issues you need to keep note of. One is to know everything that your developers are using. You have to know all of their licenses down to the last dependency, and you have to understand your legal exposure and the license requirements. And as another perspective, which comes up in due diligence but is not necessarily related just to due diligence, you'd also need to always be on top of security and quality of your open source components, because when they are embedded in your system, they immediately impact the security and quality of your system. So knowing what your developers are using isn't that trivial, as Ron mentioned. You would need to list all of the libraries that they immediately brought in, but that's not enough, because those libraries, being pieces of software in their own right, can depend on additional open source components, which can recursively depend on more and more open source components. And in fact, in a research we've done on an excess of 3,000 real commercial software projects, we found that in 64% of the time, the transitive dependencies are licensed differently than the original library that brought them along. In other words, even if your developers are adhering to your verbal policy and trying to avoid specific licenses, those licenses may still end up in components inside your system by way of transitive dependency. So you would really need to pay more attention to the components that are coming in and to the licenses that they then make you adhere to. And these things keep coming up in lawsuits and legal battles all over, where people find themselves using components that are licensed outside their declared policy and are having a really hard time even knowing about it, much less controlling it or enforcing their policy. As for security and quality, open source is software written by engineers, human engineers, the same engineers that write commercial software, and are just as susceptible to security vulnerabilities and any other bugs or issues. These things keep coming up. The good thing about open source is that the communities are actually very good at keeping track and issuing patches and fixes very quickly to security issues. The unfortunate thing is that the end user hardly ever hears about it, and there's generally a disconnect between the good work done by the community and what the end user ends up knowing about and patching or fixing the versions that they're using. And this creates an inherent flaw and security exposure in the software that embeds those open source components. And for all of those reasons, we've developed the WhiteSource tool, which is comprehensive, very lightweight and fast to set up, and provides immediate results. So I'll just quickly touch on something that Ron mentioned on his part, that the way our system works is that we have out-of-the-box plugins to various build tools that are listed here, and within 5 to 10 minutes of installation, you are all ready and good to go, and you never have to get anything from your developers ever again. The entire tracking and monitoring is completely automated, and you get up-to-date reporting at the click of a button at any time you like. And I will now show you a demo of what the system actually looks like, so you can see for yourself. Being a cloud-based software as a service solution, the entire system is available through your browser. There's nothing to install or update or maintain. what you're looking at right now is the main dashboard or the organizational dashboard for the service that's divided into three parts. The top part is the alerts, which I'll get back to in a second. The middle part is a mini inventory broken down into products. So for each of your products, you can see the list of open source components with their license and some risk factors for those licenses. And at the bottom, you would see tickets of new libraries coming in that were not handled by an automated policy. And we can also drill down into a specific library page and get a lot more information, including all of its dependencies, all the known version, newer and older than the one that you're using, references to the home page, to bug tracking, to where the code is hosted, and so on. And you can even drill down to the license. And for the popular OSI approved licenses, we've done basic risk analysis on the 7 risk factors of open source as declared by the legal community. And the text that appears here is extracted from the license text itself. And it's just here to explain why we scored specific licenses the way that we have. Let's quickly go back to the alerts. And I'll tell you that once the system knows what the inventory is made up of, it can start producing insight into that inventory. Specifically, you can see various types of alerts here, including the new version alert that lets you know when a newer version is out to the market for a specific library that you're using, security vulnerability alerts, which are covered in a specific report that I'll show you in a second, policy rejection alerts for libraries that do not comply with your predefined policies, and a few other types that also alert you on suspicious or potentially problematic libraries that appear in your inventory. For the security vulnerabilities, we have a designated report that shows you all of the vulnerable libraries in one place where you can sort them by severity and then be able to prioritize which ones you want to handle first. You'll also get more information if you drill into a specific vulnerability. It'll give you the full disclosure with the date, the severity information, the impact on your system, because a specific library may appear in various projects and products that you are developing, and references to potential fixes, workarounds, patches, or new versions that are released and can help you mitigate these security issues. There are several other reports. The one I want to show you now is what we call the due diligence report, which is designed specifically for cases where you have to demonstrate their open source governance for due diligence. And this report lists all of the libraries sorted by the licenses that they appear under, and it gives you a reference to why the system thinks this specific library is licensed on that specific license, which is something that's commonly being asked by lawyers during a due diligence process. And the nice thing here is that after spending 5 to 10 minutes doing the integration work that I've described earlier, you are now able, with a click of a button, to export this report to an Excel spreadsheet and then immediately share it with the relevant party to the due diligence. And this is something that we've spent literally weeks of many people having to produce this report in the incident that Ron has described, where we were manually managing our open source usage. This is now available within minutes and is always current and up to date, and you are immediately able to demonstrate your open source governance and prove that you are in fact on top of your open source consumption and can demonstrate compliance to an external or an internal policy. And with that, I'll conclude the demo because we are very short on time. And Neta, do we have any questions from the audience?
An important question is whether we have an offering to VCs, legal establishments, and investment bankers.
Right. So we are now starting to provide a new offering specifically for due diligence that enables all of those players that you've described to provide the relevant company, the relevant R&D organization, with a very, very easy way and a cost-effective way to run very smoothly through the due diligence process. And if anyone in the audience is interested in more information, please contact us directly.
This is an interesting question. We're asked whether the code is uploaded to the cloud. We're a SaaS company, and so the person asking is worried about his code being on the cloud.
Right, that's a very good question, because in fact we do not scan any code ever, and there is zero exposure to your intellectual property. The way our plugins work is that they only look at the open source libraries, and even then just take a binary signature of the library file. So there is no way for any system to even try to reverse engineer anything, because the information is so remote from anything original written by the developers. So in fact, there is no code ever reviewed by anything WhiteSource, and there is zero exposure to a proprietary information.
The third and last question is, and there are other questions, we're not going to have time to answer them all, but the third and last question that we're going to answer online is from someone who's planning on going through thinks that he's probably going to have a due diligence process in the second quarter of 2015, and he asks when should he start looking into managing his open source components?
Right, so the easy answer would be at any time, right? Always, as soon as possible, today. It's very easy, and it will give you a lot of time to remediate any issues that might come up. At least you should give it a couple of months, because if something does come up, you will need some time to possibly replace some libraries, or maybe buy commercial versions of libraries that have problematic licenses, or maybe code around those issues, or try to remediate security vulnerabilities. But if you are already inside the due diligence process, fortunately, integration with our system is so easy and so quick that you can even get same-day results and be able to produce the due diligence report very, very rapidly. And we are up for that as well. And if you need assistance, then we are here for you. And again, we'll be happy to take your connection directly with us and not through the webinar. And with that, we'll conclude today's session. I thank you all for joining us, and I hope to see you all soon, either directly or in any other interaction that we do. So thank you very much, and have a good day.